The Temple of Elemental Evil is one of those titles that if you were embarrassed about being a nerd, you would have to send your mom into the shop to ask for. Originally created in 1985 as a module for the Greyhawk campaign of Dungeons & Dragons, Toei, as it shall now be known, saw a PC released in 2003, helmed by designer Tim Kaine of Fallout fame, and developed by Troika, whose catalogue includes Arcanum and probably the better known Vampire the Masquerade. I remember first seeing a screenshot of Toei in a PC magazine which had really close-up images of spells being cast, and before I had even read what the game was about, I knew I was going to buy it. I have always had a strange affinity to D&D games growing up, which is bewildering since my first outing was Warriors of the Eternal Sun on the Sega Mega Drive, which as a very small child completely confused, angered and bored the arse off me all at the same time. I think the game which lit the fire for me was ironically Icewind Dale. It was far more accessible to me than say Baldur's Gate, which had more of a focus on story and dialogue and less creative freedom of characters, where in Icewind Dale you were free to create your entire party and pretty much battle your way right through to the end. Since then, I've always favoured games which follow a similar ilk, and Toei starts off by ticking the right box by allowing us to create 5 unique characters. This follows the D&D 3.5 rule set. I won't even pretend to know what those outline, but starting up will seem familiar to anyone who's played a game that is similar. Each character you create will need to be given a gender, alignment, class and stats. Alignment will dictate the type of class you can choose, and likewise certain alignments of characters won't work together, so planning the perfect party can take some consideration. Stats are selected via dice rolls which generate a random 6 numbers to be assigned to each stat type. This is where you'll probably spend most of your time before jumping into the game. There is something strangely addictive about clicking that reroll button, hoping to see a group of numbers ranging from between 15 to 18. It seldom happens, mind you, and you'll be in a grand state of mourning should you have the perfect roll only to click the reroll button out of reflex. Stats are pretty intuitive to the type of class you have chosen. Barbarians are going to benefit from strength, dexterity and constitution, whereas wizards will benefit from intellect and wisdom. Race also plays a part in choosing your class. Different races come bundled with peaks and troughs in certain stats. The elf, for example, has high dexterity but low constitution. In contrast, half-orcs have higher strength but lower intelligence and charisma. Often this will play as a benefit, as deduction from a certain attribute probably wouldn't be the most prevalent for the class you're going to choose anyway. Beyond this, we have a wide amount of skills and skill points to allocate. These are pretty easy to choose, as the skills in white are usually the most useful to your class and will give you a greater score per skill point used. You also have enough points per level to max them out. Finally, pick a name, portrait and voice and you are ready to begin. There are also pre-generated characters that you can choose, but that just detracts from the overall appeal for me. Depending on what type of party you built, you will start off in one of a few locations, but which will all lead quickly to your starting village of Homlet, famous for omelette. The first impression you will probably be left with is that this is a very pretty isometric design with somewhat of a gloomy aesthetic. The choice of lighting, down-to-earth, non-fanciful building design and music all instill an instant sense of melancholy, which at the time I remember finding rather off-putting. As per CRPG, you are equipped with a map and journal to help gain your bearings. Each of your characters will be outfitted with basic armour and a weapon to best suit their class and skill. After traipsing through quite an unnecessarily overbearing fog of war, you will find the key locations you are after in form of an inn, which is a staple of any role-playing game, and a church. Before long you will have explored the town, located the shops and obtained a few starting missions. Location hunting will become your first priority, as upon starting the world map is pretty void. New areas to travel to are obtained through dialogue with NPCs and reading journals or finding items. We know from the title of the game where we want to be heading, and the majority of the game will indeed take place there, but there are a few chances to cut your teeth and gain a few levels before you dive right in. There are 2 areas that you are likely to stumble upon at pace. The first of which is Emerald Meadows, which will give you your first proper taste of combat. Fighting in the game strays away from the real-time battles that are the standard of things like Baldur's Gate and Icewind Dale, instead adopting a turn-based system resembling something closer to Fallout or XCOM. When battles are entered, the ground your characters are standing on becomes the battle board. There are no tiles or pre-allocated footing spaces. Instead, expenditure of action allowance is dictated by the distance of each character's circumference. Character turns are displayed in the upper left corner, which will allow you to plan your moves accordingly. When it is one of your character's turns, you will be given an hourglass which depletes depending on your proposed actions. The hourglass is broken up into 2 sections, green and yellow. In order to perform an action, you will need to perform it before reaching the yellow part. Once it runs out of green, yellow is only really any good for moving further on. Left clicking on enemies will initiate your basic attack, which will be your go-to action for the majority of your characters. For more thoughtful character interaction, you can look to the right mouse button, which will bring up the action wheel. From here you can select spells depending on class, choose a type of attack or magical device or item. Successfully winning a battle will reward you with experience, and you are free to loot corpses at your heart's content. It is pretty familiar stuff, and even for the newest players it shouldn't take more than a few minutes to get the hang of it. Healing in the game can be achieved by using spells, scrolls, potions, or resting getting in. Resting can also be done in any hostile environment, but your chances of successfully spending the amount of time needed to fully heal without being disturbed are quite slim. You will probably adopt a strategy of risking an 8-hour rest to reinstate your daily allowance of spells, or retreat altogether to somewhere that is safe. Speaking of safe places, the second area you are likely to stumble upon is the Moat House. Probably not safe on the face of it, as it is crawling with bandits, giving you your first intense taste of future combat, introducing some enemy variants which do a good job of managing your expectations of how hard bigger enemies can hit. It probably won't take too long for your party to gain a level, which will be of a huge benefit in the early game due to the increase in spell limit and HP boost. As with pretty much everything in the game, HP increase upon level up is dictated by a random dice roll. A purist might accept the first value that is given to them, but for me at least I just can't accept anything too low, so it is an old fashioned back and forth between save and load until I have a party worthy of the level up. About 3 paragraphs ago I mentioned the Moat House being a safe place, so here is a pro tip. If you return to the battlement right by the entrance to the grounds, there is a giant spider guarding a chest. Give him a slaying and you will notice that your rest icon will turn green. This acts as a free place to rest, which you will be able to do so until completely healed 100% of the time. The chest also becomes pretty useful for storing an infinite amount of items in, so this fast becomes your place to pit stop for a level up, heal and inventory purge. Clearing out the Moat House, you will run into Larith. He is one of the many NPCs in the game who asks to join your party and offer assistance. He also speaks about the whereabouts of the titular temple. As with most interactions in the game, you don't have to take Larith along, you can choose to fight him instead. I would favour this option every time, as recruiting NPCs in the game is far from appealing, and this is down to one annoying characteristically understandable feature. Recruited allies manage their own inventory system. This might not sound like a bad thing, but they also take their own loot, and when they do they won't give it back, so killing an enemy whose glowing blue weapon you were eyeing up might result in you only being left with their smelly old boots. This does fit how a lone adventurer would behave, wanting to keep the loot for themselves, and this after all is a role-playing game. Realistic character traits will only help make it more immersive, but from the perspective of someone not wanting to risk losing items, I choose to leave NPCs alone. Anyway, whatever you choose to do with Larith, whether it be befriend him, or kill him, steal his staff of striking and read his diary, you are going to unlock the location to the temple. This for me is where the game actually begins. Everything previously is very much a setup to get to grips with the combat, gain a few levels for your characters and get a feel for the world. And from here on the playstyle shifts almost exclusively to combat and exploration. The temple, as expected, is huge and made up of numerous floors, each of which is peppered with rooms full of elemental varying enemies. I think this will be the make or break point for players, depending on what kind of experience you are expecting. Up to this point, you will have explored a few towns, done a few basic missions, and gained some insight into the game's world and plot. However, reaching the temple kind of cauterises all that in favour of combat, so players wanting a rich story with interesting characters and multiple locations will be left feeling deflated. From what I have read, this is true to the original campaign, and the omission of deep dialogue never did games like Dungeon Hack and Legend of Grimrock any harm, only worth mentioning for anyone looking for the next Planescape torment. So what we are left with is combat, character building and item acquisition, and it is to the game's favour that these 3 mechanics have built a first impression of being vast and intriguing, and mostly this continues to be true. Combat, as mentioned before, is the lion's share of gameplay, and as your characters progress, enemies will get harder and strategy will start to play more of a key part. Depending on your choice of party, you'll most likely have a mixture of primary attackers and magic users. The early game can be ran through by almost exclusively using standard attacks, with a few healing items and spells thrown in for good measure, but it won't take long until you are faced with a room full of what can sometimes be a staggering amount of enemies. It forces you to be considerate with your character's placement and what skills they are going to acquire upon levelling up. A well-placed tank with a high percentage chance of an attack of opportunity can switch the tides of battle in a room full of units with itchy feet. And conversely, an ill-conceived combat strategy will result in the game giving out some unforgiving blows. One comment often made about Toei is that the combat has an off-putting level of difficulty. I'd say referring to it as off-putting is down to your own tolerance, but I never found the game to be anything but rewarding. It is hard, and sometimes it's really hard, but it never feels cheap. It makes you think about a different approach and what combinations of buffs, spells and placements might work better for different enemies. There is a random element to combat. As actions are dictated by dice rolls, there is a bit of luck thrown into everything that happens, and every now and again the stars will align and all of your party members will succeed with their attacks. What can cause you to become unstuck, and something that I wasn't aware of the first time playing, is that your character's progression is capped at level 10. This is a high enough level to finish the game. However, if you made poor choices in leveling, then there isn't a way to grind for better stats or undo the choices in your character's feats. This is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have to beat the game on its terms. It can't be worn down by going away and bolstering your characters by retreading old content. You have to strive to be better than it from the get-go, and for me that makes it a solid experience. Too many games now hold your hand or give you the opportunity to get further in a way that cheapens what the original intended experience was. The obvious downside of this, of course, is that you can have put quite a few hours in before you realise that your party of adventurers just aren't up to the task, and that the only course of action is to start a game from scratch. I do think, though, that this is one of the things that has kept me playing this game for all these years. Each time you start over, you have more knowledge of the dungeon and what to expect. You will plan your characters better and preempt the late game by omitting skills and feats that you know won't be needed. Just avoid reading a player building guide. You might as well watch a let's play if you're going to go down that route. Saying the game plays by its own rules doesn't mean that it's perfectly constructed, however, and there are quite a few annoyances to point out. First off, there are quite a few bugs in the game. I'm playing on the most up-to-date GOG version, which seems to have ironed out some of the annoyances that I remember from the vanilla version, primarily that my character's attacks actually connect now. But I did run into some few anomalies. The most common occurrence was enemies just ignoring me. This tended to happen after a reload, but there were times when I could just run through a whole floor of the dungeon and no one would even bat an eyelid. A few other little odd things happened around creating my characters. My wizard was able to assign spells up to level 9 right off the bat, and my barbarian had an outlandish amount of dexterity. Surprisingly though, these little bonuses didn't particularly help or break the gameplay. The biggest annoyance of playing Toei though comes down to some of the level design. There is something about the size of the maps which doesn't quite fit with the isometric angle and the size of your characters. You often have to navigate really narrow corridors, and it can be really hard to identify what is an adjacent room and what is just a blank part of the map. This is hindered greatly by the overbearing fog of war, which even when uncovered, darkens when you move away from it. The fog is only cleared by what is in your line of sight and in a small circumference around your character, and many of the levels are comprised of thin corridors, so you never feel like you really truly know where you're going. The narrow passageways can also play down the combat in certain situations. A doorway that can only fit one character in it can cause a bottleneck where all the enemies in the room behind it are left waiting while the two people in the doorway duke it out. This actually can come in handy if your tank takes centre stage, as you won't get swarmed by enemies, but often it will cause you to retreat to a more open area to allow every character to get involved. Small grievances aside, your time in the temple is consistently enjoyable. Once you've made your way down a few levels, you will acquire new magical items and armour and level to a point where your characters start to become more interesting. High level wizard spells are a standout, and obtaining the fireball spell early on makes for a must, being that it is massively overpowered and can hit any enemies within its blast zone radius. Party members that attack from a stationary position will also acquire the ability to attack twice, which, if you have someone who has the ability to attack with a weapon in each hand, can make for a deadly flurry of attacks. The enemies in the game are also worth a mention. You'll probably get a bit bored of fighting bugbears on the first level, but after this we are introduced to more consistently interesting and well-designed creatures from the D&D universe. Big cubes of jelly perhaps excluded from that example. The progression to the lower levels isn't completely combat orientated, however. You will along your travels meet a finite number of NPCs that you can interact with. Some will ask to join your party, others will ask for freedom, and occasionally you'll be quested with the task to sabotage a rival temple. All of this is optional, but it does help break up the constant flow of encounters. Reviews of Toei cite it as one of the best translations from tabletop to screen, and despite only having minimal experience of tabletop gaming, I can certainly see the legitimacy of those comments. The game is all about your characters and how well you craft them to survive in a massive dungeon, and if that is the kind of game that appeals to you, then I can highly recommend the Temple of Elemental Evil. It isn't without its problems, and there is a sharp shift in difficulty towards the later portion of the game where you reach the elemental stages, which can leave you feeling misled to how well you are actually doing, causing you to start again after 10 plus hours or so. But this is one of the aspects of the game I actually really like. Having mentioned the few problems that I have with the game, it would be remiss of me to not mention Temple Plus. This is a mod that fixes an enormous amount of bugs, along with giving you the option to turn on a number of enhancements. The most standout feature is the ability to increase the level cap from 10 to what I assume is an unlimited number. You can also turn on the option to always gain maximum HP on level ups. The fog of war can be completely turned off. Internal resolution no longer has to match actual, so you can run at 1280 by 720 on a 2K output, and now you can create 8 characters at the start of the game rather than the original 5. It's quite comforting to me to know that the fanbase for the game shared many of the same annoyances that I had and decided to fix them all in a tiny mod. I played through the game using the original official patches for this review, but since then I have jumped straight back in with a mod, and it's great. It also boots aside your original install, so it won't affect going back and playing the intended version, and save games will work fine too. This raises a difficult conundrum now as to which version of the game I recommend. I have been playing the original for nearly 15 years now, and it has succeeded in giving me a kicking every time I've played it, which has always seen me coming back for more. However, the mod does make the game massively more recommendable to someone who is a new player, so I might have to go with that. In either instance, I find the game to be one of the more immersive CRPGs that I've played. I mentioned right at the beginning that the atmosphere is a bit gloomy and depressing, but I think it needs to be. The worlds you believe in the most are often derived from hostile lands. It helps to give weight to a relatable emotion. The soundtrack is also worth a mention. It is dark and moody and not entirely fitting with the medieval fantasy vibe, but it works all the more better for it and suits the art style perfectly.
Me go.
A little bit of a difficult one to explain why I recommend it, but if it is your kind of game, you will have probably stumbled across it at some point in the past. Worth it alone for the satisfaction of clearing a whole room of enemies with one fireball.
Okay.